Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we will speak about the geopolitical importance of critical raw materials and the European Union strategy on the matter. Joining me for this discussion are Marie Lemuel and Nicolas Poitier, both researchers here at Bruegel. Marie, Nicolas, thank you for joining The Sound of Economics.
Hi, Giuseppe.
Thanks a lot for having us.
And Marie, this is your first time recording a podcast for us, so that's really nice to have you here. So let's get into the topic of our conversation. During her 2022 State of the Union speech, European Commission's President Ursula von der Leyen called to address the EU's dependencies on important critical raw materials by diversifying and securing a domestic and sustainable supply of critical raw materials. On the 16th of March 2023, the Critical Raw Material Act was released by the European Commission. The Commission has proposed a comprehensive set of actions to ensure the EU's access to a secure, diversified, affordable and sustainable supply of critical raw materials. And critical raw materials, for everyone who might not be familiar to, are indispensable for a wide set of strategic sectors, including the net zero industry, the digital industry, aerospace and defense sectors. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has made the European dependency on Russian fossil fuels a geopolitical calamity. The ensuing energy crisis in Europe has raised awareness of geopolitical risks in key supply chains. Coming after the pandemic-induced supply chains disruptions, policymakers are now asking whether Europe risks creating new dependencies in its drive to decarbonize its economy. When replacing an internal combustion engine car running on Russian fossil fuels with an electric vehicle with batteries based on Chinese minerals, are we not just swapping one dependency for another? Nicolas, Marie, in order to assess the European strategy on critical raw materials, today let's look at three aspects. Firstly, the EU's position in clean tech value chains, the geopolitical risks from concentrated markets, and last but not least, the challenge of shaping the rapidly expanding markets for materials of the future, especially for the electric vehicle batteries. And last but not least, I will want to ask your assessment about the new piece of EU regulation which deals with the issue. But first things first, what is the Europe's exposure to critical raw material?
Thanks, Giuseppe. So I think what really sets the scene for this entire discussion is to remember the fact that when it comes to importing raw materials into Europe, and especially for clean tech goods, they actually come embedded in products that are manufactured elsewhere. So I'll give two examples. When it comes to, for example, permanent magnets that are very useful for wind turbines and electric vehicles, Europe actually imports 12 times more permanent magnets than the rare earths that go into their manufacturing. And likewise for lithium. Europe imports about 70 times more lithium batteries than lithium itself. And this is really just driven by the fact that Europe doesn't produce much of these goods at home, and it needs to import components and intermediate goods for its industry. So what this means is that we can think about ways of ensuring that Europe has direct access to raw materials, but this is really just a small part of the picture. What really matters is more the entire value chain, like going a couple of steps, and we need to think about how the supply of our own suppliers looks like and whether there are bottlenecks in that supply chain. And I think one of the fundamental questions that Europe really needs to think about is where does it want to position itself in the value chain? At which stage does it want to create value?
Nicolas, do you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I think this is a key question that goes beyond the whole raw materials part. Europe is very focused on kind of reshoring at the moment, many of these products, many of these value chains. This is where, when we come back to the discussion of the policy, where a lot of this policy ends up. But the point we want to make with the piece that we're going to publish hopefully very soon is that this is just a small part of the picture. If you manage to reshore these products, yes, then you need to have the direct access to these materials, but that might not be very, very realistic. Therefore, the challenge is much more global. The challenge is really about how do you make sure that the value chains which we are embedded in are diversified. So basically here, focusing on the material that goes into a Chinese solar panel and saying, oh, we import polysilicon from China, is a bit besides of the point when 90% of our solar panels come from China. So here, the strategy has to be which part of this value chain can we reshore? That's kind of the industrial policy part. But basically, given that there might be severe limits on that, how we can make sure that our suppliers have diversified supply chains in their critical raw materials as well.
Well, we're going to get more into this when we're going to discuss about the EU regulation on the matter, because it will be interesting to see exactly this balance between the ambition on the actual critical raw materials and the ambition towards diversifying of the value chain. But what you just said, Nicholas, brings us to our second topic. So looking really at the larger scale, because we're not speaking about value chains which are only based on specific continents or group of states. We're speaking about a global dimension. We should rather speak about the geopolitical risks which are linked to import concentrations, for example. What are those risks?
Yes, indeed. So we identify in our analysis 3 distinct risks or 3 distinct problems for the EU. The first one is really the resilience of the value chains. And that was Marie was talking about. Basically, these value chains are rather outside of the EU. And here we have a kind of a second order risk. If we have something like the pandemic, our problem was not as much getting the materials, but getting the products in which these materials goes. And just producing this in-house might make our own production resilient, but not the production of our suppliers. So that's the first type of risk. What happens if we have another pandemic, if some kind of political shock or whatever shock in the world happens? That's risk number 1. And here, the exposure is mostly second order. But then there's, as you say, this geopolitical risk. And here the risk is really that someone uses our dependency or a monopoly that they might have against the EU to extort the EU, basically to extort some kind of political concessions. And we have seen this in the past. So like basically the key example here that we think about is in 2010 when there was a bit of a ruffle between China and Japan. Japan detained some Chinese fishermen or pseudo-fishermen, we don't know, that were in contested waters, which Japan claims as their own and China claims as their own. And to kind of press them free, China imposed an export ban on rare earths. Rare earth is the umbrella term for all kinds of minerals, but for a rare earth at the time in 2010, I think 98% of rare earth were actually mined in China. So China had a virtual monopoly. And even though the total value of imports from China to Japan, the total were just like 140 million, something like this. Actually, key Japanese industries needed this to operate. So basically, they could not work. Even though the value was very small, it was a key part of the Japanese industries, and therefore Japan basically had to make concessions here and had to release these fishermen. So that is kind of the risk that everyone is afraid of, that this will happen again in the parts of critical raw materials where we see clear concentration. The EU has set here in its policy generally a threshold of 65% of market concentration, above it sees problematic. And about the critical raw materials that are targeted by EU policy, for a third of them, this is basically the case. Now, the interesting part here is that when we look at the episode about rare earths, actually there was a reaction already. And we see that mining has quite diversified. And basically, when we look at where actually market concentration in China is right now, it's much less on the mining part. It's really about the refining. So most of these minerals are actually quite diversified. We have seen in those that were concentrated, we've seen some diversification, for instance, rare earth. But in the end of the day, the refining still mostly happened in China. And here really the question is, how can you break this up, this monopoly of China? So here, I think the mining part is just one part, the refining part is another part. And the question is here, for instance, what can you do with European policy in this area?
Yeah, so just to add on what you just said, Niklas, I think the geopolitical risk is a bit more of a static vision of the situation where, given the current industrial makeup of European economy, there are raw materials that we do import, right? So what I said about them coming in through goods, we still need direct access to some raw materials, and for some of them, about 6 or 7, they do come from a single country. And so for those, it's important to be vigilant. It's important to monitor the situation, to assess whether there's likely to be supply risk. But there's a second part of the question, which is a bit more on the forward-looking side. And so this is a bit, for example, the battery supply chain discussion and developing industries for clean tech good manufacturing.
Indeed. I mean, you mentioned the batteries, and my next question would have been exactly on that direction. because Europe faces the challenge of shaping these rapidly expanding markets for these materials of the future. And batteries are one of them. It is almost a dual challenge. You know, you have a rapid growth on one side, and then you have this market fragmentation that you are describing. How do we cope with it?
So to explain what this dual challenge really is about, the decarbonization challenge, which is being addressed across the world, will require a lot more of these goods to be deployed worldwide, which means that we have what I call an investment challenge, which is really about digging up a lot more of these materials, a lot more of these metals out of the ground. And this needs to be done wherever reserves are available. Geography is a bit of a secondary issue. It's really about quantity. And this matters, both because the world is going towards decarbonization, but also it's important for Europe's own industrial policy plans, where we want to set up some industries, and especially this is where I bring in the batteries for electric vehicles. This is really one of the things that the Commission is pushing. And for that, Europe is going to need access to the components that go into these batteries. So estimates by the Commission are that we'll need twice as much cobalt as we currently do, and up to 6 times as much lithium. So really there is a challenge in terms of just getting quantities online. That's the first part. And then the second part of the dual challenge is bringing in geography, and how do we make sure that there isn't a scramble for resources, but that these minerals are available to all manufacturers, whether they're European or otherwise. And so here, looking at geography shows that there are important bottlenecks and crunch points that we need to worry about. And so it's linking in with the rare earth discussion that Niklas just mentioned. So if we look at the distribution of reserves of lithium and cobalt, these two kind of headline materials for batteries, the geological reserves are relatively widespread across the world. Mining itself is mostly distributed, but where the crunch is at the refining stage. And so 2 showcase examples. So Australia is the largest producer of lithium, and 94% of its lithium goes to China for refining. And likewise for cobalt, Congo is the largest producer of that metal, and 99% of that goes to China for refining. And so we see that really this is where the problem is. So China has a market power both in being a large supplier, but also in being a large buyer of these minerals. And so this is really where the challenge lies. And this brings in the fragmented markets discussion. We can say that in an ideal world, what we want to strive for is a global unified market where these metals are essentially commodity markets like we have for aluminum and copper. Just a small parenthesis, these are also important minerals for the green transition. We're going to need up to 30% more of those, but they're not raising as many issues precisely because these markets are already kind of at this ideal that we want to go for. And so the challenge is getting these additional minerals in the same to the same level.
Yeah, so I think here the risk is basically that we see for a scramble for those resources because of this massive investment challenge, that big economies use their economic, not just economic, but also military or other geopolitical power to get exclusive access to minerals. And the problem there would be it kind of would fragment markets, and it would create also kind of political linkages that have all kinds of political implications. So the fear here is really that the key policy here that is on everyone's mind on the Chinese side is the BRI, that, for instance, China would link investments with exclusive access to these minerals. The same we could see on the other side, on the European and the American side, where you see efforts to decouple the European value chains from the American value chains. And if this ends up creating separated markets, then we create all kinds of risk. The first thing is, of course, that this will limit the amount of investment that goes. It makes everything more political, everything more difficult. It could slow down basically the rollout of something like electric vehicles. But also, if we have fragmented markets, we get much more dependent on single suppliers, and single suppliers will get much more dependent on single demand.
To me, if I may jump on this reflection about fragmentations versus diversification, a lot of the narrative that we are hearing around seems always to lean towards some sort of more fragmentation, like breaking up globalization, somehow coming back into a block system of the world. But what we are actually really seeing on the ground, it's more something that is a little bit more simple and a little bit more complex and maybe less worrying at the same time as well. It seems that the narrative is being raised up to a higher level than the actual reality of what is being trying to be made, which is basically more diversification. So not a break of the global value chains, but basically having different variable geometries for those value chains, so that if one value chain will get disrupted, then there is always some lifeline on the other ones. So it seems to me, even the more aggressive United States strategy seems to me less aggressive than it might be portrayed in the sense of there is nowhere that I can see that there is a complete call for separating the value chains completely, or like cutting off China completely, or creating complete decoupling of the world economy, in this case, critical raw materials, for instance. What's your take on that?
So I would agree and disagree at the same time. So I would agree very much with the assessment that I think right now the discussion is a bit overloaded, or a bit overexcited maybe, and that it might even be a bit of a distraction. But at the same time, I think there are key steps that are taken now. They're small steps, but they might lead to this kind of separation. So what we see, for instance, in the United States Inflation Reduction Act is that it excludes for consumer EV subsidies any EV that has Chinese minerals in them. So here really a condition to get US subsidies is that you completely separate from the Chinese value chain. It's problematic from a legal perspective, or international law perspective maybe. From a European perspective, it's great if your goal is diversification, this might help that. But in this is a very specific case that in this specific case might not matter as much, but the more we see proliferation of these kind of things, the more we might see breakup. So I think this is kind of the challenge for EU and US policymakers, is kind of like, on the one hand, we have this dominance of China in the refining of minerals, then gives them political leverage, and that leads to market concentration that is problematic. At the same time, the policies that to break them up are very, very problematic in their own right. So
Let me challenge you on what you just said. It's true that American industry will not get subsidies for Chinese produced components for the batteries, but there will be a lot of producers which might not get subsidies anyway, because they might find it cheaper to still buy Chinese. So the reality on the ground when you go to the real economy is a little bit more complex than that, especially in the United States, where dependencies or interdependencies between the two economies are still there. You know, it's perhaps a step into the direction of making things more American, that for sure. But is it a step to make things exclusively American? That's a question mark.
Indeed. So I think there's the question about reshoring, and this is where a lot of the discussion is right now on the US side, and I guess we will get to that in a minute in the EU policy discussion. That is probably unrealistic, no? And there's like a lot of political momentum that in the end, the hard economic facts, you might be able to push yourself through in one or two industries with very invasive and very destructive policies. But in the end of the day, you will not get rid of overseas manufacturing. The labor costs are just too high in Europe, in the US. But at the same time, we see attempts to break out China of some of these value chains. So the EV subsidies here are one example. Again, this would be just applied to the US market and will not maybe affect global markets as well, but it's already like an example. We see similar things in the solar panel industry, where the US has put higher tariffs on Chinese solar panels. The result is that they are affected somewhere else, but still the US tries to pursue the manufacturers in Malaysia, for instance, for using Chinese inputs into these. So they accuse them of basically just being a storefront. So there's like this attempt to drag China out. And I think this is, at the moment, the question is how effective will this be? And the minerals are really at the bottom of that. So basically, there's a lot of policies there. There's a lot of emphasis on the critical raw materials. I would agree that it might be a bit of a distraction, but the challenge there is real. Like, we have concentration in one country we have some issues with. And then the question is, how do we make the whole value chain resilient? And that's why we think it has to be international, because at the end of the day, US might force China out of these EV value chains for domestic EVs in the US. But it will probably not force it out of European EVs. And still we might end up in a market where still 99% or 98% of some refining happens in China. Just the 1% that goes to the US is happening somewhere else, and we still have the same problem. So this is the limit of domestic policy.
Well, let me switch to again the European debate because we started with that, and as we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the Commission has announced its own Raw Material Act. The regulation sets clear benchmarks for domestic capacities along the strategic raw material supply chain, and to diversify EU supply by 2030. So that's quite soon, 2030. It says that at least 10% of the EU's national consumption for extraction will be reshored in the EU. At least 40% of the EU annual consumption for processing. So here we're speaking about refining, what Nicholas was just pointing out as one of the big problems. At least 15% of the EU annual consumption for recycling, and not more than 65% of the Union annual consumption of each strategic raw material at any relevant stage of processing from a single third country. Can we explain to our listeners which would be the roadmap, provided all the challenges that you've been outlining so far, which would be the roadmap to achieve such objectives, and what is your initial assessment of such a policy response?
Right. So to essentially link back with the beginning of the discussion, so the frame of mind of these targets is it's a bit of a protectionist reflex that follows from the ethos of the time of what we were just saying about how the US is really trying to carve China out of its supply chains and reshoring, bringing economic activity back home because this feels safer. But as we were discussing before, the raw materials is really the beginning of the supply chain, and it's a rather low value added activity. And so it's a trade-off between, to what extent do we want this security part versus how much of it makes economic sense. And what we were saying is that a lot of the bottlenecks happen kind of in the between stages of the supply chain. And so the mining objectives seem rather pulled out of the sky, especially because it's very material dependent. So when we talk about critical raw materials, it's actually a list of about 34 elements that the Commission, with some criteria about economic importance and security of supply, has identified as potentially problematic. And to link back to the discussion, there are some of which that we import today in our given economic structure, where we need to be vigilant about security of supply. And for those, some of the import values are actually quite small. So it's realistic to think that maybe with some manageable investments, we might be able to put enough online that we don't have this dependency 65% from a single source. But that's not the case for the entire list of minerals. And as the second part of the discussion about batteries and these supply chains of the future, it seems like a distraction compared to the real challenge and the quantities that need to be brought online entirely.
Nicholas, what's your assessment?
Yeah, I would second that. So basically, we got a bit of a spat now about basically the role of China there. But in the end of the day, I think we all agree on basically the challenges. It's somewhere else, no? We import a lot of products, manufactured products from China. Now we're worried about the few minerals we import from there. But the overall problem where these products come from, that's a different strategy. And here I think the two strategies intersect with. We have on the one hand the attempt to reshore some of these supplies with the Net Zero Industry Act. And then the second time we have this Critical Raw Materials Act that tries to also reshore production of minerals. Now, the two kind of interact in a way. And in some value chains, actually European production could happen on the industrial stage. I think EVs are here the prime example where we actually see quite a lot of private sector investment in EU production, meaning we need a lot of inputs from the outside. For other minerals, Probably not happen that much. So there's kind of like the question, where does this stuff will come from? And here, the main challenge will be external, one way or another. So we might be able, for some of the rare earths where we found a mine or a potential place to mine in Sweden, we might be able to do that domestically. But for lithium, for cobalt, there's no chance that we will actually bring enough investment online in Europe to get even close to there. And the question is then, what kind of message, what kind of tools do we use, and what kind of message do we send to the countries that we need to do this mining and refining? And here, the strategy as it stands right now is rather inward looking. So the goals are to do stuff domestically, but actually the tools are also domestic, but then we don't really have the tools right now, or we don't discuss the tools right now that actually allow this to happen outside the EU. There are some trade policy components, there are some development aid components that are much more important for this international investment and diversification of the whole supply chain than actually whether we refine 40% or 30% in the EU. It's probably unrealistic anyway, but it's a bit of a distraction.
Thank you. And we could speak for much longer on that. And I'm pretty sure that we will be back on this. And we also have a piece written by Marie and Nicholas, which will be linked in the show notes. And I would like to also remind everyone that, as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Marie, Nicholas, thanks a lot for this conversation, and thanks to our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Giuseppe.